Welcome to the Book Flood Podcast, brought to you by goldenlibraries.com. I am your host, Tom Nixon. My guest this week is Matt de la Peña. Matt is the #1 New York Times Bestselling Newbery Medal-winning author of 7 young adult novels, including Mexican WhiteBoy and We Were Here, 2 middle grade novels, and 8 picture books, including The Perfect Place and Last Stop on Market Street. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom.
So why don't we start with your career trajectory? Maybe you can throw in your education information as well.
Yeah, so I went to college actually on a basketball scholarship, became the first in my family to go to college. And honestly, it wasn't until I got to college that I became a big reader. And then once I started to become a big reader, I started to kind of be interested in what if I could write something of my own. So I started doing little spoken word poems. And then my poems were getting too long to be poems. So I started to try a short story format. And then over my undergrad career, I started to think about writing something longer. And then I got very lucky because I went to a small private college in Northern California called the University of Pacific. And the professors there, they actually helped me apply to get an MFA at San Diego State in creative writing, which I didn't even know that was a possibility. But once I got there, that's when I guess you could say I started to actually pursue writing as a career. I didn't know if I could ever sell a book, but I wanted to try to at least write one. And then from there, it's a 3-year program. I'm actually sitting in an office at San Diego State now because I now teach in that same program. But yeah, so I wrote, I guess I was writing a short story collection, I thought at the time, about a kid growing up next to the Mexican border, and just kind of like that code switching and growing up mixed race. And I thought I was writing that, but then one of the stories I started seemed a little different, and I realized it was a separate project, and it became my first book, which is called Ball Don't Lie. And then, eventually when Ball Don't Lie came out, I went back to that collection and made it a novel, and that became Mexican WhiteBoy. So that's where I started.
So tell me, I enjoyed looking at your bio, and one of the things that fascinated me, tell me the correlation between writing books and getting basketball scholarships.
Yeah, I think, there's something, I never was the kind of player who excelled in an organized way. So I was always a better pickup player than I was playing in a team environment. So, I'm getting in the weeds of basketball, but I just love the artistry and the dance of basketball. I've always loved that. I loved playing down at the gym all day with the characters there. I love the world of basketball. So I think when I started to write, I tried to get the sounds of basketball in a way when I was doing spoken word poetry. But also, gyms are full of story. And so I think that became a big inspiration for me about characters and people. And, I had the guys that I played basketball with down at the park or at the gym, in addition to my family members. So those were all kind of the inspirations for early characters. And honestly, I'll never experience grace like I did on a basketball court, but writing to me is as close as I can get.
Nice. In 2016, you won the NCTE Intellectual Freedom Award. How did that come about?
Well, one of my books, Mexican WhiteBoy, was actually pulled from a curriculum called the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson, Arizona. And what happened was, this was my first experience with being banned. It was back in, I think, 2011. And I ended up visiting one of the high schools where the book was pulled from the curriculum. And, I got to meet with students there. And what I found is it was kind of a symbiotic relationship because I was there supporting them in that they had just lost their program. And we were talking about the importance of the program. But they were supporting me because the student body was 100% Mexican, and sometimes I write from a place of not being Mexican enough, and so their embrace of me made me feel like I belonged in that setting. And for them, I was supporting their desire to get their program back. So it was an incredible experience. I got to use the honorarium that they gave me to buy back books that had been taken out of their hands. So I think that's where the Intellectual Freedom Award came from, is just that experience of working with that community to try to help them figure out how to get their program back that they valued so much.
So banned in 2011. Now it's so. Then it was a story. Now I think everybody's getting banned.
Yeah, now it's so common. I mean, back then, I'll be honest. I thought, getting banned is like a badge of honor. And that's what a lot of young writers think when they're coming up. It's like, wow, your book is banned. That means you're doing something that's making an impact in some way. But what you realize is that sometimes your book is being withheld from the very readers you want to reach. And that's what happened in Tucson. And now, I've gotten caught up in some of the book banning that's happening today, with a picture book, Milo Imagines the World. And, we're now aware, authors are aware, like, I can see that this could be something that could get me into the crosshairs of the banning. For me, I thought Milo Imagines the World, it would be they'd group me in with critical race theory, which I don't actually want to be part of any groups like that, right? But what it was is there's one image in the book, no text about it, but there's one image that's where the character is speculating about possibly this could be a same-sex couple. And that is it's one picture, and that is the reason that the book has run into trouble in different places, most specifically Florida.
So what does your writing process look like?
So, I have a hard time with first drafts, so they take me a long time, but I love revision. Revision is my favorite thing in the world. So I usually do a number of drafts, because I feel like, especially if you're writing a picture book, you have two jobs. You have to get the story right, and then you have to get the music right. And I spend so much of my time trying to get the music of a picture book right. So that's a big part of my process, revision. I also just, sometimes people say writers end up writing the same book again and again, just in different ways. And I think I would kind of, fit that category, because I'm just obsessed with certain things, and I'm always going to gravitate toward them, like, mixed race identity. What is living next to a border mean? Things like that, working class communities, and just the dignity of working class men. I'm very interested in following working class men and how they find dignity in a changing world. So those are some of the things I'm just really obsessed with. So I go back to them again and again. And if I have a new story idea, I'll kind of write it in a little file. Don't let myself do it yet, or execute it right away. But because I have one that's on deadline. But every time I'm done, I go back to this list of all these stories that I want to do, and I get to choose one. And that's a pretty fun part of the process too.
I think your latest book was The Perfect Place, came out this year.
Yeah.
What was the idea for that?
So The Perfect Place is kind of me exploring code switching, but also this desire that so many of us have, that we are trying to live like the majority, whatever that might be. What we see in the media, the perfect family, or we're taught to aspire to get certain educational goals met because we're told that that is the chosen path. And so I just wanted to follow a young character in a picture book setting and see if I could follow him trying to fit into that mold and be somebody that he's been told by the media that he should try to be, and then see what happens. So it's kind of, there's also another thing that I haven't really talked much about, which is the book is very much me thinking about where the wild things are. And in that book, Max, he gets in trouble at home in his safe suburban home. And then he experiments with going to this place where the wild things are, right? And then eventually he retreats back to the safe suburban house that he occupies and the life that he lives. And I was like, what if somebody lives in the wild area, and what would that look like? And what if they dreamed of going to that safe suburban world, and then would they want to come back? So it was kind of an experiment to see what that looked like. So that was kind of where the book started. And then it ended up also kind of exploring what it means to make a mistake and how does that impact you. And maybe when you make mistakes, you figure out where you belong.
Let's talk a little bit about Last Stop on Market Street.
Sure.
This was a book that just took off for you, obviously, like gangbusters. Won the Newbery Medal, 16. For the illustrator, also got the Coretta Scott King Illustrator Honor and got a Caldecott Honor. That may be your most awarded book. You've done pretty well on that front, certainly. Was that the book that changed everything for you?
Yeah. So something happened early in my career that was a game changer for me personally, which is my very first book was turned into a movie. And when that happened, I got a very healthy check, which got me to get out of debt. And so that was the first great thing that happened to me in the book world. But in terms of changing my career dramatically, I was writing a bunch of novels, and then I had done a couple picture books, and Last Stop, was very well received. And that did change my whole, life. My wife and I always say the only reason we can afford a house is because of a picture book, So we're very, very thankful for that book. And I think what was special about that book from the creative side was that I wrote a text that I thought was possibly too heavy, but I collaborated with Christian Robinson, who came in and had these incredible, whimsical, pieces that sort of fit next to the text and undercut some of the heavy. So I always say Christian made it a picture book. For me, before that, it was just a poem that was a little bit possibly heavy on the subject matter. And so I'm always thankful for what he can do. And by the way, just illustrators in general, I just can't believe how important images are in graphic novels and picture books. They just.
And your illustrator was Paula Escobar?
Yeah, for The Perfect Place. Yeah. And in Last Stop, it was Christian Robinson.
So that was the book where when did you obviously are still working as a lecturer at San Diego State. When did you realize that you could actually do this full time and survive? You're living in a city that is not cheap.
Yeah. Well, I was used to being poor. So I guess the first 10 years of my career, I didn't have very much money, but it wasn't uncommon. It was normal, and I could at least pay my rent. I was living in New York City at the time, and I could survive on just writing, probably starting in around 2010 or 11. I would do events. Sometimes I'd go to conferences or schools. So I would supplement my income with speaking, income. But I never really had a job outside of writing. Sometimes teach creative writing classes through NYU Extension or through low residency programs. So, because I always in the back of my mind knew I wanted to work with young writers who were going to be the voices of tomorrow. Even when I was brand new, I thought that because I just had such a great experience in my MFA program. But I would say 2011, I became a full-time writer. And then after Last Stop on Market Street did well, that's when, for the first time in my life, I actually got to save money. That was a cool experience because I was married. I remember I had a conversation with my wife before we got married. I sat her down very dramatically in an Italian restaurant, and I said, I have to tell you something. And she's like, what? And I said, I'm never going to make money in my life. And I thought this was going to be a beautiful moment where she was going to say, I don't care. It's okay. But she didn't. She actually said, wow, I have to really think about this. That was kind of a step back. But she ended up coming back to me later and saying, okay, I'm in. That was the first time we actually got to save. And my wife is in the book world too. She's a publicist for children's books. So we're both we understand each other's roles in the world, and that's made it helpful, but it's just wonderful that we can actually, have a life with our 2 kids now.
Excellent. One of the things that folks may not know is that Last Stop on Market Street won the Newbery. That was the book for me that I first said, so there's a guy named Matt de la Peña, and I went back and read some of your books. But also I went, picture book won the Newbery. Yeah. And there's only one other book in the early 80s that has ever done that. That's not something that they do.
Yeah, that was why I was very shocked when I got the call. In fact, when I got the call, I was asleep because, when you write a picture book, you're not thinking that somebody's going to win an award or anything. So it wasn't even on my radar. And I'd only written YA, so I wasn't even that conscious of the Newbery, except for as a kid. But then I got the call, and they told me that I'd won the Newbery for Last Stop on Market Street. And then I hung up. I was actually in Minneapolis at the time teaching at Hamline University for a week. And I called my wife, and I said, I think I just won the Newbery. And she said, are you sure? And I said, no. And then she said, okay. And then she said, who was it that called you? Was it a man or a woman? Because she's very savvy in the world of, publishing.
Oh, right.
So she was looking up the judges, and I said it was a man. And she goes, okay, because the Caldecott chair was a woman and the Newbery was a man. So I think it might be true. And I was like, whoa. So we were surprised. And, I think what I've come to understand is every committee on for all these awards, right? Caldecott, Newbery, Prince, this is their opportunity to say what they think is important in the world of children's literature. And I always think that there's got to be like 40 great books every year, maybe even more, but 40 that might be in the conversation for some award. And then that group decides this is their voice. This is what we believe in this year as this group. And so you just feel, you understand a lot of it is luck, and you feel fortunate,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. What are some of the challenges of being a writer? I think a lot of people, you write one book and they think you're instantly successful, instantly rich, instantly all those kinds of things.
Yep. I think, nobody sees like the struggles. Nobody sees all the drafts or anything like that. People they're not paying attention. And that's what you have to realize is like, I'm teaching students, and there's one person I was speaking to yesterday who's just an incredible writer. He's writing this book about, he served time in the Ukraine war as a voluntary soldier. And he wrote this incredible book about that. And he's been rejected by about 15 agents so far. And he has a couple that are, very interested in the book, but haven't committed yet. And it's been a 6-month process. And I was talking to him about, even if it happens after 2 years, everybody's going to say after it happens, wow, it was like an overnight success for you, because nobody's paying attention until something big happens. So you just kind of learn that's your part of the story, is the struggle, that part where only you know what's happening. But the frustrating part about being a writer, I think, especially early on, is that, not everyone's going to like your book. Is it legal to quote Charles Barkley on this podcast, Tom? Okay. So he has this saying where he says, if everybody likes you, you're lying to someone. And I think that's such an important thing to consider when you put out a book. It's like some people love realistic fiction. Some people love fantasy. So, you're not going to put out a book that appeals to everyone. It's impossible. So you learn that criticism is just part of your career. And sometimes your books are going to be used in ways that make you feel frustrated, or somebody's going to take something out of your book that isn't really there in terms of your intentions. But I think what you have to learn is just to let go and realize that after the book is out of your hands and it's coming out through a publisher, it is no longer just your story, and it becomes a tool for conversations or a tool for political rhetoric. And you just kind of have to kind of give up, relinquish control of things like that. But I would say the hardest part about being a writer is that every time you sit down to write a new story, you have this vision in your head of what it can be, and you'll never measure up to that vision. And so there's an inherent failure in writing every story because you will never measure up to your initial inspiration. And so that's probably the hardest thing, because you always try. But
It was interesting. You talked about once you've written the book, you lose control of it. And I don't know how many different authors I've heard who had books turned into movies who went, that's nothing like what I wrote.
totally. And I have a theory about it. So when you read a book, you are in charge of so much of that process as the reader. You get to imagine the characters moving through the setting. You get to imagine the expression on their face based on few clues that the writer lays out there. But when then the reader watches the movie version of that story, all of that ownership is gone, because now we actually see what the director and the casting director, what they wanted on screen for that moment. I feel like there are a lot of reluctant readers because it's hard work to read a book, but it's in some ways more rewarding to read a book because you get to have a bigger role in the process. And so I think as writers, we have the same thing. We have the vision in our head. And then when we see it played out in a movie or in a play, maybe it's slightly different than what we had imagined.
Is there a book or a series of books from your childhood that still resonates with you?
Like I said, I wasn't a huge reader, but one book that really was important to me was The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. That was a really seminal book for me that I read over and over as a kid. Even though I wasn't a big reader, I read that book many times. And I have to be candid, like I also read a ton of basketball journals and magazines because that was my passion. And back then I thought, this isn't real reading, and it's something that I probably shouldn't advertise to teachers and librarians. But what I've come to realize as an adult is that reading was just as valid as any other type of reading, especially because what I was most interested in is the things that players had to overcome to get where they were in the NBA. So I was reading narrative, and I feel like that was like incredible experience for when I turned to writing my own stories.
So what are you reading now?
Okay, well, I read some, children's books, and I read some adult novels. I think right now I pulled a stack. Let's see. I just finished this graphic novel that I think is incredible, and I recommend it to everyone. It's called Mexikid, and this book is hilarious. It's a great story about a kid who lives in America but has family on the other side in Mexico. The author's name is Pedro Martin, and I highly recommend this graphic novel. And then a couple adult novels that I just finished a Dennis Johnson novel called Train Dreams that I love. And then one of the best books I've read in the last 5 years is called Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And this story was amazing. I think what I loved about it is she gave humanity to somebody living in, I guess, a political region that I don't identify with, but it made me love that character. And I think anybody who can add humanity to the people who we think are on the quote unquote other side, that's what it's all about.
Excellent. I want to thank you for coming on the podcast, Matt. We'll have some links in the show notes to websites and social media and all that for you. For viewers, please like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Again, Matt, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Tom.